Good morning, folks. So I'm going to cover about 50 slides in about 20 minutes, so we're going to go a little quick. So this is kind of an odd talk. It's kind of my last 30 years of being a nerd kind of summarized into a bunch of weird graphics and visualizations. Most of the stuff you're going to see is stuff like a graphic or a research I did just over the last 20-something years, all kind of stacked together in a very confusing way intentionally. But what I'm hoping that you get away from this is that anytime you see a number, an email address, a phone number, a QR code, a serial number, that you start immediately thinking about what is the entire space that that number fits into. How do I find the rest of them? How are they being allocated? What does allocation mean? What is the timestamp? Like, how much information can you get by just seeing a single number or a couple numbers in a sequence? So if you're bored, technically inclined, introverted, have no friends, and poor, a network is everything. A network is the only way you're going to effectively leave your house or find friends or find people. So I like to describe the internet as screaming into the void to find friends, because that's how basically I found all my friends. It ends up being your video game. It ends up being your social network. It's your thrills. It's your drama. It's your crime spree. It's everything else in between, right? So, a network can be anything, right? A network can be any connectivity between entities and points and relationships. The most simple network a lot of us had back in the 80s, 90s was a telephone. It's a magic device you pick up and you either do a little brr, 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 or you hit some numbers, and it just magically teleports you to a different, place in your neighborhood, a different city, a different country, a different state. You could be anywhere, basically, just by dialing some magic numbers. And to me, that felt like you're like casting a spell. Like, I can pick any random numbers out of a hat and magically do something, like cause my parents to pay a $100 phone bill, and everything else in between. So there's lots and lots of things that are really cool about networks. But if you want to explore a network and you weren't like a cool kid and didn't have access to like X25 pads or early ARPANET or things like that, you had a phone. And if you didn't have a computer, you had a notebook and a phone. And maybe a graph paper if you're fancy. Or if you're cheap, you printed out your own graph paper at the library. So generally you just need three things. You need a node, some way to connect to the network. You need some way to explore it. What's your strategy? Is it prefix, sequential, random, ordering, whatever? What's your process for recording the results of your exploration? You probably need one more thing. You probably need something to do when your node gets flagged for abuse. So when people start getting mad about what you're doing with your node, how do you find another node, or how do you otherwise avoid going to jail? That's really important too. Oh, and I guess there's a couple more things. You kind of have to have a stomach for risk. If you are already concerned about the cops breaking down your door for other reasons, then doing computer crime is not that bad, because you're like, well, I'm already worried about being busted, so it's not that much additional stress. But if you're not used to that, you kind of have to stomach the additional risk of doing shady internet things or computer things at the same time. And that's a little bit of a blocker for a lot of folks. And of course, the last thing you need, of course, is money. You need some way to have the equipment, to have a phone, to have a telephone line, especially a telephone line that you don't have to pay the bill for. Those are all very important. At one point, we had an apartment complex where the entire bundle of telco cables ran through the drywall. We just pull a pair out and use them randomly and see who got arrested. And that was our way of figuring out which pairs were good. So this is all way in internet pre-crime days. So anyway, so if you've got a piece of graph paper and you've got a telephone, you can build a network. You can build a map. So you got your big 100 by 100 grid here. This is effectively 10,000 numbers, 512, 454, 000 at the top left, 999 the bottom right. And you pick up the phone and you start dialing. So you just call a random number, you fill in a little blank. What did I get? Is it a modem? Is it a carrier? Is it a voice? Is it in a particular order? So if you're looking at the strategy, like, how would you go about figuring out where the patterns are, right? You can just kind of play Battleship and throw random darts at this thing, or you can go look up phone books. You can go find other information. You can figure out what are the main phone number for IBM downtown. That's what I did. How do I find all the cool business stuff to hack? So 10,000 phone calls later, you build a big graph. You've got a big list of carriers, fax machine, voice lines, busy signals, all kinds of fun things you find. But this is 10,000 phone calls by hand, with 30 seconds to a minute each, and then writing a little square in, right? So it's not the fastest way to get anything done. So if you're a cool kid and you can, go find a list of all the numbers from your local zines or BBSs, you start getting an idea of like, where's the stuff to go find? Who actually can afford a modem? Which ranges should I dial? One of the really cool things about phone number allocations, especially old landlines, is they typically were all in the same area. So 512-454, for example, was Austin Downtown Business District. And I love that prefix because I found all the coolest stuff there for years. I mean, from radio control towers to Kmart's HVAC to everything else in between, like that range was engraved in my brain for a decade or more. I was war dialing it until it became very illegal. So if you actually are smart enough to get a modem or able to eventually find a modem in a trash can like I did, I eventually, like, when everyone else had like Nintendo, I finally got my Atari. When everyone else had like the 46, got my 3D6 and so on. I was doing a lot of dumpster diving and I eventually found a 300 baud Hayes modem in a dumpster, grabbed that. No, 1200 baud at the time. And it was good. You could at least get a carrier and things like that. But you still need a phone line. So my whole world changed when my mom got a new job. So she got a job as a medical transcriptionist, one of the very first work-from-home jobs you could have. And what's amazing about that is she had an ISDN line and 3 phone lines and modems. And she went to sleep at 9. I woke up around 8. And I basically just dialed all night long, every night, until they figured it out. But her workplace kept calling, like, something's wrong with your line. We're seeing this. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. Just, it's turned off right now. So I don't think she still knows to this date. Anyways, so modems are fun. They let you automate stuff. And if you can use cool tools like ToneLoc, you can now do really cool maps like we did before, but more automatically. ToneLoc was amazing. Has anyone here used ToneLoc? Awesome. So ToneLoc was not just one of the very first war dialers that was badass, but it was the very first war dialer that took advantage of the US Robotics voice detection feature. So you don't have to dial every, you're not going to scream at everyone's ear for 30 seconds going wee, 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 wee. Instead, you're going to say like, oh, it's a human voice on there. Let me go and just disconnect and say no carrier. So the US Robotics modems could do voice detection, which means you could build a graph like this almost automatically because it could detect, voice versus modem versus fax and carrier. Unfortunately, I did not have an US Robotics. I had a crappy Hayes, right? So I had to do this by hand. So every time you dial the number, you're just listening to the screeching. Then you hear some like old man yelling at you and be like, who's calling me at 5 a.m.? And I'm like, okay, asshole. And you go to the next one. So you just kind of mark it down with a bunch of keystrokes through it. And that's how you build out your map, is you just kind of hit some keys based on who answers the phone. So again, it's pretty manual, but you can build the network pretty well. So this is really cool because like ToneMap, this tool is called ToneMap. It's a kind of accessory tool to ToneLoc. This thing changed my life. Be able to look at a network as a big grid like this and be able to quickly pick out the patterns. Like, where are all the busy signals? Okay, there's these big stripes here. These are like big chunks of the telephone allocation range that never pick up. They're always gonna go to busy signal. You can also start figuring out, well, where are all the modems? Where are all the fax pools? Where are all the things I don't wanna dial? I don't wanna call the police department repeatedly, right? I don't wanna call the 911 services on their backend lines. Where are the telco loops? Where are the out dials you can find? So lots of really cool stuff you can find here. But being able to represent it in a map like that was huge. So when you start really digging into this stuff, now you can start finding all the cool stuff. Now you can find like everything from your business BBSs to your hacker stuff and everything else in between. This is how you start finding your zines, all your different like anarchist cookbooks and all the stuff that kind of led to the industry that we have today, right? All the cool tools that got us to where we need to be. So if you want to like turn the AC off and on in your Kmart, if you want to tweak settings, your local FM transmitter, I mean, there was amazing how much stuff was dial-up based and actually still is dial-up based. Until at least 2012, every Gymboree children's store still had a modem hooked up and you could dial into it, use the same static password to connect to their RAS daemon on a Windows NT 4.0 server and download all the transactions, including credit card data, for the store. And that's how they pulled their inventory and their sales data for the stores. They just dialed into all of them all the time. And of course, I had the whole list of all the Gymborees in the US at that point because why not? And of course, the SAM file was cracked really quickly. So, long story short, they threw away one of their machines once and wiped the drive. And I was like, oh, this is fantastic. Here's the default credential to all of the national Gymboree stores. Anyway, so things like that still exist. There's still systems out there that are primarily dial-up based. Now, when you think about the 90s, 80s, and so on, especially the 90s, the only way to remotely access a system was the phone system. That was it. If you're a small business, you're a retail shop, you're Kmart, there's no internet. Like, there's no satellite. You're basically stuck. You are going to either use your radio system or you're going to be using a phone line. And if you're going to be further than a couple miles away, you're using a phone line for it. So everything you wanted to mess with in the whole world was connected by phone lines. And if you can get to the phone line, you can control the building, the HVAC, the door systems, everything else in between. So a lot of really bizarre stuff out there, and a lot of it still exists today. So the challenge, of course, with dial-up, especially in the 90s, is if you want to dial outside of your local area code, it gets really expensive really quick. Everything is a long-distance call outside of your local area code. So I want to call like Round Rock from Austin, which is like our suburb. It would have cost like a lot more money than the free kind of basic stuff. And this isn't included. This is not even a cell line. This is a landline they charge you money for calling over. Now, if you want to start dialing things like you want to go to call Houston, you want to call your friend's BBS, like you got to start coming up with really, significant amount of money, or you need to use someone else's phone line, or you need to use someone's stolen credit card number. And since we're a bunch of poor kids, we use probably those last two the most. Now, this gets worse when you start looking at overseas. I want to start dialing into the UK. I want to start calling into some like Malaysian BBS a friend of mine's running. Like now you're talking about like hundreds of dollars per hour of phone bills coming in. And this is why so much of the, the freaking kind of fraud stuff happened, because you couldn't afford to do it otherwise. I mean, resources really were the biggest limiter. Both resource of time, how long does it take to dial each number? 30 to 60 seconds. You need a modem, you need a line, you need to get your line not, resulting in you going to jail and being busted. And then you need like the phone calls, you need to be able to pay the bill. Like the biggest blockers for discovery until probably last almost like 10 years were really financial. So speaking about this, like even this year, I had a reporter call me asking for a quote about something. I called him back, didn't really look at the number. I got a text message from Verizon 5 minutes later saying, we just charged you $75. I'm like, it's 2024. What the hell's going on? Oh, you don't have international on your plan. I'm like, I just returned a phone call. What's wrong with you people? So anyways, it's amazing how expensive international dialing still is today. So if you wanted to, let's say, make phone calls internationally and you didn't want to pay for them and you didn't want to use your own phone line for it because you get arrested and you didn't want to go hang off the roof of some apartment complex, then what you did is you found something called an outdial. And outdials are really cool. There's kind of two ways to get into an outdial. An outdial is effectively a modem you dial into that you can then dial back out of again, right? So you dial into like a modem bank, like an Access Port Array or Shiva Land Rover, and you basically dial back out of that system using the phone line of whoever's running the thing. So lots of universities ran outdials. Some of them are internet connected, where you basically telnet into it. So often you dial up into one BBS, use their telnet option to connect to an outdial, use the outdial to then make a connection to something else. Then you actually run PPPP over that telnet session. So you're effectively running PPP over telnet over an existing PPP, and you just keep doing that. So some friends of mine, we decided we want to do outdial ring all the way around the world. So we managed to dial every country kind of in a ring going all the way around, set it PPPP across all of it, and eventually route a packet all the way around. It took like 37 seconds for the packet to go all the way around through all the outdials. But if you want to be untraceable, that was about as good as it got back in the day, is use other people's phone lines, use stolen credit card numbers, and use outdials to bounce your connections wherever you need to, and then you can dial whatever's available from that particular thing. And a lot of these universities, I guess we didn't think there was too much problem with it because they typically had a better relationship with the telcos than we did, so they could make more international calls cheaper and so on. So these things eventually got shut off. This is an outtake from FRAC where they listed a bunch of outdials, but there's many variants of these things. One of my favorite ones were just phone numbers you called, and then if you pushed a couple of keys, it'd give you another dial tone. And be like, sweet, now you just dial back out again. And those things were fantastic. So around this time, I was like, okay, well, the phone stuff is fun, but like, I want to be on the internet, but I don't know what real internet it is yet. So beep, 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 you got mail. So I started playing with AOL back in the day because it sends you CDs everywhere, right? Even if you didn't want to use AOL, you had to use AOL because everyone had a damn CD. So we found out, of course, you can make as many trial accounts as you want with the credit card generators because they wouldn't actually validate your credit card. It was too expensive for them to actually try to do a pre-auth back then. So until they actually ran the charge, they don't know if the credit card's real. And so you use your credit card generator that makes a LUN code with a random name and whatever, and that was that. So we're just creating new credit cards every week, basically, to keep our AOL trials going indefinitely. When you start digging into AOL, like how does it actually work, right? Well, you're just doing your normal ATDT, dial a number, you get some electronic screaming in the background. You do authentication, usually like PAP or CHAP, or it could just be like a login-based telnet flow, depending on which one you dial into. Then you set up PPP on top of that, and then inside of that, you connect to over TCP/IP, America Online, AOL.com, port 5190, which is also, if you saw the talk yesterday on the AIM retro server, it's the same backend protocol as the authentication server for Oscar. So but this protocol is based on TAC. So AOL was weird in that it was kind of like the internet, except for the internet in a box. Everything you did was basically through this tiny little window screen where you had everything kind of constrained. And you could typically only open 1 or 2 windows at a time. You could only be in one chat group at a time. And technically you had internet access. You could have opened a browser, Netscape Navigator or whatever and done things. But for the most part, it would kill your internet connection when you closed the AOL UI. So AOL was the internet for a lot of people and often still is, unfortunately. So there's some fun tricks though. Like you could, one of the cool things about AOL is that it was the best wares server ever because you could share wares and downloads with people without actually having to transfer the files. You just give them a link to the file on AOL servers, you can download it, and so effectively when you're trading wares on AOL, you're effectively just trading file links to their internal servers back and forth. And that was a lot of fun. So we created tons of wares bots that would like share files, things like that. We created all kinds of phishing and punchers and programs and wrote a bunch of crappy Visual Basic back then, and a bunch of Trojans and backdoors and all that fun stuff. And the idea was basically to make it self-propagating, where you would phish so many accounts and you have so many credentials that you could just log into AOL forever. So at some point we had something like 12,000 Earthlink accounts, like 50,000 AOL logins that we can use at any point in time, and 1 million out dials. So it's like, we're done. We don't need to pay for internet for the next 20 years that we thought. And then of course AOL died. But we also did some fun things like created IRC bridges from AOL chats to FNet. And the FNet folks hated that. We brought all the AOL losers over to IRC, and they just thought it was the worst thing ever, and we thought it was the funniest thing ever. So they would like DDoS our bots and things like that, but it was a lot of fun. So another neat thing you do with AOL, because it was like a thick client, a lot of the constraints of the client were built into the UX, not built into the protocol. So if you built a TCP proxy that would just, in the early days of AOL 2.5, you didn't have a proxy option, so you just hex edit the binary and modify America Online AOL.com to 127.0.0.0, null byte basically. And then it would just connect to your loopback instead. Then your own little tool would basically take the connection, proxy the traffic, and then drop packets you didn't want. This worked great from like 2.5 to 4.0, and then 4.0 did a change of the checksum algorithm that made it a pain in the ass, and I couldn't figure it out, so I stopped working on it. But in the meantime, what this let us do is open as many chat windows as we want to do at once. So if you're trying to scrape screen names and phish people and things like that, you want to have as many chat rooms open as you can and then constantly scrape all the windows with the Windows APIs. And you could only really open one chat room at a time with a normal client. But if you drop the close message from the server, you can have as many windows open as you wanted to. And so we just automated the hell out of all the phishing, all the where stuff, all the whatever. Then I finally realized that AOL was stupid. I should do something else in my life. But until then, one thing that was really neat that I played with at the time, and I don't have the code for it, but someone else did a much better job than me, was with Archive Team, is AOL had this thing called AOL internal links. And this is kind of where it gets back to discovery. You had these different kind of resource identifier prefixes, then a unique ID for all your files and so on, and you could find really cool stuff. You could find like the community action team, basically the admins, if you will. You could find all their tools hidden inside these URLs just by brute forcing them, sending the commands and seeing what window popped up, screen scrape the window and repeat and screenshot it, and then just go through all the results in the morning, figure out what cool stuff you found. Oftentimes, the admin tools would have a login on the first page of the form, but none of the subsequent form pages had authentication. So you can just find the second page of the admin tool and then take over, and that's how you could go through all the billing systems and mess with all the Strata servers, and we basically had full access to AOL for a long time back then. So these folks, the archive team, did a really cool job of brute forcing all the file IDs and putting all of them on archive.org and then doing a nice map of what type of files they found. So they basically just ripped all of AOL's file systems before it died and put it online, so you can still dig through it today. So let me move over a little bit to a different topic, which is open field. So internet, right? So before we had that 10,000 grid, now we've got a 4.2 billion grid, which is IPv4. You get 000 at the top, 2555 at the bottom. If you wanted to scan things on the internet and discover stuff, well, even at 64 byte packets, it's 502 bits per second. You've got a 38.4 dial-up. That's about 75 packets per second if you're absolutely lucky and you don't kill the machine. You got to be really targeted. So if you're trying to find things you're trying to look for things on the internet, you had to go have a starting point. Where do you go find things to go scan because you can't scan the whole thing with a dial-up connection? Well, you jump on IRC and you find some friends and you scan the hell out of their ranges. And you join different chat groups and you look at IPs, you look at logs, you look at backdoor stuff and all the stuff. So effectively you had to go find the IP space that you wanted to look for because it's so inefficient to scan the whole thing. So that was kind of the biggest challenge back then, was how do you quickly scan stuff? Now, these days, you can scan a lot faster, right? You can take a single DigitalOcean node, scan 50,000 packets per second, conservatively, and cover the whole internet really quickly. So, for example, you could scan, if you have a single packet exploit, you could hit most of IPv4 that's out in about 20 hours on a single DO node. You can go a lot faster if you write cleaner code, but that's just kind of offhand the reliable number. You want to, you got a cool exploit, you want to throw it all of Russia, you can do it in about 10 minutes right now off a really cheap VPS. So the metrics have changed quite a bit. And instead of having these big, grid maps, you now have these great maps showing here's the allocation of IPs on the internet. Now, the fun thing about this, of course, any graph of a world map versus cyber attacks or internet connections or pings, it's all as a population map, so none of these graphs matter. So anytime you ever see a map with a bunch of points on it, just laugh at them and be like, yes, that's a population graph. This tells me nothing. But this tells you a little bit more. This actually goes into the Hilbert curve graph of the whole IPv4 space. You can see the reserved prefixes, your 00 at the top, your 224s up at the top, and then everything else is kind of broken up based on sub-blocks and so on. So some blocks are really, really dense, the bright reds and stuff. Some of them are really green. Left side is UDP scans, right side is ICMP only, then overlaid on top of each other. So if you want to look what the internet really looks like, here, the left side is pretty much the whole V4, and the right side is a couple of blow-ups kind of deep into the weeds of some particular things. So the bottom right one is the SIP graph for Germany. So for some reason, Germany has tons and tons of externally exposed SIP servers. Well, the reason is every home broadband gateway has a SIP gateway built into it that's externally exposed. All the Fritz boxes, basically. So One of the cool things about the internet these days is it's so dense. So there's about 3.7 million allocated IPv4 space at a given time. Of those, 774 million are live at any given point. Like literally, you can just go and show it in and pull them up or ping them and it'll be there. So the cool thing about this is you literally have a 1 in 5 chance of picking a random IP out of a hat, hitting ping, and getting a response. That is amazing. Like there's so much cool stuff to explore at this point. Like you talk about living in an aquarium. IPv4 is now a very small aquarium. We've gone from being something that we can never adequately enumerate to something we can enumerate very quickly that everyone's watching this whole aquarium all day long. So some other ways you can look at the data. I love doing visualization. This is a flattening of an IPv4 scan by protocol, then overlaid by each other. So how often does POP3 correlate to SMTP to IMAP to POP? Almost identically, right? So it's always cool to look at pairs of ports, pairs of services, overlay them on a full rollout like this, and you can see how often does X correlate with Y just quickly and visually. So mail servers obviously correlate with themselves pretty well. When you start zooming out of IP space too, and you start putting it back on a grid, instead of using a 10 by 10 grid or use more of like a power 2 grid, like 64, 8 by 8, et cetera, you start seeing some pretty cool patterns. Like on the far left one here, all the left side blue dots, those are actually Cisco routers. And we said, okay, all my Cisco routers are at the network edge. That makes sense. They're serving that particular /24 subnet, and then everything else is kind of a mix of stuff. On the right side, you can also see a little bit, this is kind of a, I forget which graph this was, it's either like number of ports open or latency or something like that. But you also have this big, these two bands at the top where nothing's been allocated. So you can see which ranges are the ISPs not allocating yet. Now, since we zoomed out a little bit, you can probably see it better from the back of the room, but you can start seeing these kind of diagonal stripes as well. Like, why would you have a diagonal stripe on an IPv4 graph when it's layered by /24? Well, it ends up every one of these DHCP subnets has a slightly staggered starting IP. So all your IPs are slowly shifted over by subnet, which is pretty cool. But you wouldn't have noticed this pattern until you zoomed out in the full /16 and looked at the whole block at once. And I am actually out of time, so I apologize. But I'll skim ahead a little bit. So you can actually take the internet graph, throw it back into ToneLook again, use ToneLook as a visualization for it. V6 is huge, tons of V6 stuff, 223 million IPv6 showed alone. You can now war dial on the internet really quickly. Unfortunately, it's super illegal, so you can do cool things with war dialing. And if you wanted to go through and start exploring the stuff behind the firewalls, all your NATs and carrier grade stuff, there's 18 billion IoT devices theoretically hiding behind them. And if you want to look for what are the most common v4 IPs used in NAT, here's what they are, because that's what I do all day. And if you want to look for the top used octets of private IP space to quickly find them, here's the top 10 octets that are being used in internal IPs, because I do this stuff all the way for work. And if you think P2P, IPFS, and Web3 are better, they're far worse. They're super discoverable, and you can enumerate every possible node of most crypto /PDP /IPVSS nodes in like an hour, and then DDoS them and make them DDoS other things for you really quickly, but that's a different talk. And yeah, anything's a network if you look at it the right way. The same approach works almost anywhere. Costs really are no longer the main barrier for anything, and go discover all the things. And thank you very much. So if you have any questions, x@htm.io. I think our next talk starts at 11:30, so might have a couple seconds for questions, but if not, feel free to boot me out. Thanks to RunZero, of course, for my day job, for having me out here, paying bills, stuff like that. And we do fun discovery stuff, and we have a free version if you want to discover your home network stuff. Any questions before I get booted? Cool, awesome. Well, thanks for letting me share. Thanks.